Hello, good evening, everybody, and thank you for joining us for another episode of Secular Soapbox. We have strong secular opinions, and we like to share them a lot. Today, I'm going to be joined with Scott Williamson. Excuse me. He'll be co-hosting with me today. Bryce is taking a break for the day. We're going to be discussing the problem of evil. We're going to be having a dialogue with Ryan Downie and Benjamin Watkins. And I'm missing somebody. Danny. I'm missing a Danny here. I'm sorry about that, brother. And Danny as well. We're going to be talking about the problem of evil, as previously mentioned. Honestly, I think there's a lot of different interpretations of what the problem of evil even means. But I think today we're going to be talking specifically about why a, quote, good God would create evil in the world and why that's a problem. I want to first begin by thanking our producers, Wes, Josh and Kat the Humanist, Jena Miyu, and our patron Sunny Shell, Phil Calderone, Jena Miyu, Mikey, Famine, Oz, Linear, and Laura Magee. Hey everybody, how are we doing today?
I'm doing well.
Very good. So whose idea was this? Who's like, hey guys, we need to talk about the problem of evil. This is what we're doing.
I think it was Wes. Wes sent me a message and was like, "Hey, would you like to come on and discuss the problem of evil?" And I was like, "Yeah, I'd love to." Ryan and I have been working on a piece of late on the problem of evil, so we
talk about. Speak to it. What's this piece of late you've been working on?
So I guess to first kind of start off and characterize the problem. Because the label problem of evil is in at least one sense misleading. It sounds like there might just be this one problem of evil. However, there's many different families of problem of evil. And so one of the common distinctions is between what's known as evidential forms of the problem of evil and logical forms of the problem of evil. And so evidential forms of evil say, look, evil is evidence against the existence of an omnipotent and morally perfect God, whereas a logical problem of evil says, look, the existence of evil and the existence of a perfect being like God entails a contradiction. It is positively irrational. Like the idea that there could be a world with suffering, sin, and evil in it, and a perfect being just doesn't make any logical sense. And so Ryan and I have been working on a form of this latter type of argument, the logical problem of evil, and we've called it the argument from imperfection. So it's very common to hear apologists say that the logical problem of evil is dead, and they'll often quote, several different people saying that it's dead, but we don't think it's dead. We actually think that there's lots of spirited discussions about it in the professional literature. Professional philosophers still defend forms.
Insofar as you think this is something worth considering?
Absolutely. So there's also another distinction. So there's the evidential and logical distinction, but there's also another distinction, a general and particular problem. So general problems of evil will appeal to general facts, like the kinds, amounts, and distributions of evil in the world, whereas particular arguments from evil will hone in on a particular kind of evil and say, look, there's facts about these kinds of suffering that make them particularly thorny knots to untie. To give an example, the problem of horrendous suffering, this idea that people can suffer so horrendously that they lose themselves entirely, just seems straightforwardly incompatible with a being that is perfectly loving and perfectly moral and cares about what happens to us in this world.
So is this more or less, just to be clear, so this is an argument against some sort of benevolent being?
Yes. So they're going to have two properties essentially, and so the two properties, one is omnipotence. So these are claims about God's power, what He can do. He can do any act in which the description of it is logically coherent. So He's only constrained by logic. God can do anything other than make true contradictions. And then the other property is moral perfection or maximal benevolence. So this idea that God is in no way blameworthy for any of His acts, and He's always praiseworthy and always worthy of our worship, and maximally cares about our well-being in impartial ways.
How do you get from one to the other? How do you get from morality is thus and so, therefore we have an omnipotent being, or vice versa?
I don't think I understood the question. Sorry.
With the omnibenevolence. Okay, so we have a omnibenevolent God. Reality is such and so, therefore God is omnipotent. I'm just not seeing the connection between omnipotence and omnibenevolence.
Well, so no, these are features that we're saying is essential to God that give rise to a problem of evil. So the problem of evil asks, can God do anything about evil in the world? Well, yes, because he's omnipotent. He can do anything. To say that God can't do something would be to, in some way, deny that he was omnipotent. And moral perfection comes from the question of, well, would God want to prevent evil? Well, yes, because God is wholly worthy of our worship. So he would be perfectly good, perfectly moral. And so a perfectly moral being and a perfectly loving being would want to eliminate evil so far as they could. So if we are conceding that there's this being that can eliminate evil and that would want to eliminate evil, well, now we have a problem if we concede there is evil. Because there shouldn't be, it seems that those properties of omnipotence and moral perfection would entail, or at least strongly imply, that we would not observe evils. Observing evils in the world becomes surprising. And so we would want to say that it's more probable on something like a hypothesis of difference.
Okay, what if we subtract the omnipotence from this and say that this is the best God could do given what limited power he had?
Exactly. So what this move is available. This is one way of avoiding the problem of evil. But however, what is the theological cost of doing that? And so most perfect being theists will say, well, that it just implies that God doesn't exist because God is by concept an omnipotent being. So if you're denying that God is omnipotent, you're just denying that he even exists, because this omnipotence seems to follow from the concept of being wholly worthy of our worship. So we're talking about a being that demands our attention, that demands our reverence, and would respond to our religious concerns, things like justice being done in the end, or providing us with an afterlife where we could spend this infinite relationship with a maximal being. And so if you're going to diminish his power, well, now it's not clear that we're talking about the greatest possible being that's wholly worthy of our worship. We're talking about some lesser being. And so you can ask the question, is this being worthy of our worship? Or is it like the clockwork God of deism? Is this just a God that's a mind that sets the universe in motion and walks away? And it doesn't seem like that conception of God really is worthy of our worship. It actually doesn't seem like it has any implications for our lives in particular at all. Because, again, you can start bringing in other considerations that make the problem of evil so powerful. That would be why the universe is mostly hostile to life. Like when we look in the universe, it's a big, vast universe, and much of it is much too hot, much too cold, not enough matter, and all these different ways in which the universe is hostile to life. It just seems like that fits more in with that deistic clockwork type God. And that would be a challenge to perfect being theism, because perfect being theism just isn't compatible with that because of the property of being wholly worthy of worship.
Yeah. Well, some of the Christians that tackle this issue, they come up with a lot of, whether they're good arguments or not, I don't think that they're really good arguments at all at the end of the day, but they might say, well, what God did on the cross was the solution. Like, all the evil is wrapped up with the cross. So that negates that suffering, that terrible death was a perfect antidote or price to pay for it, right? And they'll argue for that. I don't buy it. I don't think it makes a lot of sense, but they argue that way. Another argument would be, well, evil according to who? Like, according to you? For me, like when I have these kind of discussions with a theist, like especially a Christian or a Muslim, I will oftentimes just go by their own internal critiques. Like, does God hate evil? Does God hate sin? Does he hate it? Well, yes, he does, obviously. So if he hates sin, then why does he allow it? Is he not powerful enough to do? Then they'll say, well, free will. Well, in that case, are we saying that God lets humans kind of pull his strings? And kind of just delve into this just kind of follow their logic along and watch it crumble. That's kind of the tactic I take. And so far, it seems like a lot of Christians just aren't prepared for it, or haven't thought about it, or
I think you're right. I think it boils down to, for me anyway, the gist of it is the universe that we exist in doesn't allow me to, it doesn't suggest to me, rather, that the best possible being created this particular universe. Now, maybe such a being exists, I doubt. I mean, I think that this universe existing unto itself sort of eliminates that possibility. But, I just can't get there. All right, so I get that. That's the gist of this for me. I'm not a huge fan myself of the problem of evil, because I think that to me, the existence of evil could just indicate a God that created every possible universe, and this just happens to be one of them.
I wanted to speak to been delineated between two types of problems of evil: the logical and the evidential problem. And I wanted to give an analogy to help differentiate between those two types. Imagine a city where there's this perfectly good, all-powerful, all-knowing mayor. Okay, the idea is that what the logical problem of evil tries to show is that even one little bit of trash on the side of the road makes it such that that mayor does not exist, right? Even any imperfection in that city, such a mayor does not exist. What the evidential problem of evil is not trying to go that far. It's saying if someone were to tell you that there's a perfectly good, all-knowing, all-powerful mayor of the city, and you go and visit it, if it was overall pretty good, great health care, not that much litter, yeah, occasionally you have a theft, burglary here and there, but very, very sparingly. You would be like, okay, that's fine, right? But the point of what the people that are forwarding the evidential problem of evils is they're likening it to the case where you visit the city and it's just overridden with crime. Everyone's hungry, right? There's like tons of imperfections in the city. It's just probably the case that such a mayor doesn't exist. So the idea is that the logical problem of evil, in other words, to summarize, even one imperfection in the city, such a being doesn't exist. The evidential problem of evil is saying it's the amount. If we see a certain amount of suffering in the city, certain amount of crime, a certain amount of litter, whatever, right, then that God probably doesn't exist. But a little bit amount, okay, maybe such a being might exist. And that's how I understand the distinction.
That's a very good analogy.
All these arguments are more or less like stepping stones, though, because this isn't going to get someone to not believe in God. It's just going to get them like a tear down from the God they believe in, which is a step in the right direction, of course. But I just like the problem of evil is a conversation that you have with theists. That at the end of the day, I hope that you walk away with the realization, of course, that they're always going to walk away a theist still at the end of this. Like even if you convince them that their God is evil, they might still believe in it. Beyond that, so is there utility for this particular conversation?
Yes,
at least for us who non-believers anyway.
So I would want to distinguish our project as real atheologians, our project Real Atheology, from that of, say, a Christian apologist. So for us, arguments are not weapons. They're not meant to try to bash other people. They're not even there to try to win arguments. They're not there to try to convert people. So we're not trying to bring people into the fold. What we want to say is that arguments are tools. Arguments are tools for thinking about big questions in the philosophy of religion. And can we use these tools to make progress? So can we use them to help resolve disagreements that we might have with other theists, so that we can both get closer to the truth in dialoguing in that way? So it's kind of the Socratic method. So when you ask the question, well, what is the practical use of these? Well, the practical use is having dialogues for their own sake to get us closer to the truth. And I think that these arguments on both sides help us achieve that. Not just the arguments from evil on our side, but also cosmological and teleological arguments on the other side. They give us something to think about and something to respond to. And you can go back and forth. And you're right. At the end of the day, we're not, the philosophy doesn't, it's just an empirical fact that philosophy doesn't make progress by, a bunch of people getting together and then all resolving all their disagreements, and everyone ends up in the same camp, and then they all go home.
Well, to be honest, I'm with you all the way here. Honestly, because I have conversations with people, especially fundamentalists, hardcore fundamentalists, who take this perfection thing quite seriously, to the point where they have to admittedly deny that certain things mean X, Y, Z in order to maintain this belief. And we've gotten there. Like, okay, look, you're right. If this is true, if my God isn't perfect, then you're 100% correct. But you know what? My God is perfect, so screw you. Like, I get it. Like, these conversations are important on that level. But I also want to mention briefly, I recognize now that my mic, for whatever reason, apparently is garbage tonight.
I think we lost him.
And he's gone.
Rip. Ryan, did you want to say anything? You're the only one that hasn't spoken, so.
Yeah, I'm just
the floor is yours, Ryan.
Yeah, no. Well, you guys have already said such great things, so I do think there's utility to these arguments, as Ben was talking about. I think for me, actually, the problem of evil and its sort of related argument, the problem of hiddenness, was actually pretty important for me in changing my mind. So I grew up in a very fundamentalist sort of framework, Christian fundamental or evangelical position. And those were two very important arguments in changing my mind. So I think it does have utility in changing minds. But as Ben said, I don't think that's the main reason we offer these arguments. It's like we're not evangelizing for atheism in any way, but it does help people who are kind of on the fence, maybe. It does sort of carve out the logical space, so these, I actually like, I don't know if any of you have read Is There a God, which is with Graham Oppy and Kenneth Pierce. Have you guys heard of that book at all?
Yeah.
No.
It's a great book. They do a great job. Both of them are very just well-reasoned, and they do a good job presenting their respective sides. And they make really good points in there about the nature of philosophical disagreements and arguments and sort of what their utility is. And a lot of it is about carving out the space so that we can make decisions and like Ben said, resolve issues. And it really does put pressure, on the theist to say, okay, if I hold these things, then I might be forced to hold these other things. So maybe I need to adjust X, Y, and Z in my position, and then we go from there. And I think it can lead to very fruitful results, even if both parties sort of end up more convinced of their positions. They at least hold, hopefully, more rational versions of those positions, and progress can be made in that way. So, so I think, yeah, go ahead.
No, you're good, man. I'm sorry. By the way, I hope that my audio is a little bit better after all that, but if not, I apologize. This is just going to get to the next, because I don't want to touch anything because it makes me go away. But on that, I don't want to say that there's not utility for it. I was honestly just trying to be straightforward, a little bit curious about it, just so that somebody could jump in and be like, well, damn, like I talk to fundamentalists all the time that want to talk this nonsense to me, and you know what, it comes in handy then. And that's where I have this conversation. And it's a lot of fun. It's engaging, and you talk to a lot of interesting people. I think it challenges me in ways that I otherwise wouldn't think to challenge myself in.
Well, to Brian's point, and I've kind of experienced this, and I've kind of sort of changed my delivery, because I have conversations. I love these kind of conversations with theists, with people of different opinions about a lot of things, right? And what I've come to learn is that, like, if I tell people, I do street epistemology, or I start going into it and they're kind of familiar with it, and they're like, this is just a tool atheists use to convert us over. You're actually lying when you say you're not in the interest of moving people into skepticism. Let's be real. Like, and the thing that I've done is, instead of like kick back on that, what I've done is I say, granted, let me just put all my cards on the table here and be honest. Like, I'm an atheist and I'm a skeptic, and I like having these conversations because I like causing you to question your beliefs, right? And just be honest about it and just get that out of the way.
Well, that's just doing philosophy. So it should be, you should delineate. So the term apologist comes from a Socratic dialogue called the Apology, where Socrates is put on trial, and Socrates gives this big speech defending himself. So it's a defense. An apologist is someone who gives a defense of the faith. But so that's very different. That's saying, look, this is the faith that we're a part of, and we're going to build walls around that faith. Wherever there's objections, we're going to fortify, this defense for these objections, and we're going to, that way people can come to the faith and go, hey, here's a defense of the faith. We will do that on both sides. So the atheologian admits, look, if for philosophical dialectical purposes, we are non-theists. This is we'll admit that at the start, but then we'll also start carving out space for all sides of the discussion. And we'll use those resources to then say, okay, this is why we're skeptical here. This is why we're skeptical here. This is why we're skeptical here. These are the problems that we see with the view. And so people can do what they want to with those tools. They can convert, they can deconvert, they can try to fix problems, they can possibly try to raise other problems for our view as well. And that's all well and good. Our goal at the end of the day is not to give a defense in which atheism is always going to come out on top, but to lay the landscape, the philosophical landscape, the dialectical landscape of this conversation, so that people can talk past each other less. We can raise the level of discourse between people who disagree. We can help people try to resolve disagreements to find common ground. And if we're lucky, we might make a little bit of progress here and there. Some people might learn, that's the beauty of the philosophy of religion is it touches on so many different areas like philosophy of mind, epistemology, logic, morality, just all these different big, deep philosophical questions. And people learn a lot just from being exposed to those kinds of conversations. So we've made plenty of enemies in our own camp. We've made plenty of enemies in the theist camp because we're not going around trying to please other people. We're kind of that Socratic figure who's just kind of in the background, just annoying everyone by asking questions.
That gives me
I think there's a really big. Oh, I was going to say, I think there's a really big difference, though, between seeking to be philosophers and seeking to be apologists. So, of course, if you're an atheist or something, but you're aiming towards being a philosopher, yeah, you might offer arguments, or you probably will offer arguments for your position. And in a technical sense, you are giving an apology in a sense, or you are doing apologetics in that way. But that's very different from being an apologist, I think, where your goal is to maintain, in many ways, the belief you start. You want to win, right? So your job is to defend your position. And I don't have much respect for that position on either side, whether someone is like dedicated to being an atheist at all costs.
What are some of the more challenging conversations that you have had where people really want to hold on to this idea of a perfect God? Surely you've at least had one or two conversations with somebody who, can stand their ground, that is to say, on a conversation like that and not cower away and feel like they have properly dueled, you know what I mean? Have you ever had a conversation like that, or am I
very
much here?
Sure. So I recently got to debate publicly Trent Horn of Catholic Answers. So he's the he makes a living on apologetics. And so he's what's known in the literature as a Thomist or a classical theist. So the idea, there's a Catholic tradition from St. Anselm, St. Augustine, Thomas Aquinas, Duns Scotus, medieval philosophers like this that have this very, very particular model of God that's also Catholic dogma at this point. And so I got to debate him, and that was a really, really high level philosophical debate in the sense that he and I had swapped opening statements beforehand. I was bringing some of the best material from metaphysical naturalism in the literature today, and he was bringing some of the best from the classical theist tradition in the literature today. And so we just let those two positions clash. And so, there wasn't, we both understood each other's views. We weren't talking past each other. We weren't setting up gotcha questions. We were actually, here's the claims we're putting on the table. This is how they're being responded to. And then we'll, in the rebuttal section, we'll parse different things out. And then in the cross-examining section, we asked each other very pointed questions about the things we had discussed. And so the substance there is, at the real high level, you can start to see why people have reasonable disagreements about this conversation. Why certain people are like, no, I really think this model is the best model for these theoretical reasons. Now, those might not have any real practical use in certain sense. You might, at the end of the day, you might just say, look, I think this model explains this feature of reality better than this model. And so that's something that we have to take seriously. That's, as atheologians, we take and we go, and sometimes we find ourselves, look, this is a chip that probably falls in your favor. You can see that. However, I think it's outweighed by these other chips that favor naturalism, and it's a back and forth of kind of dispensing with burdens of proof and just letting evidential chips fall where they may. And I think
how about on his end? Did Trent give you any little tidbit that you walked away with that you're like, man, I got to think about this some more? Anything particular that stands out?
So particularly for that exchange, he gave an argument from causal finitism. So the idea, he put several different paradoxes on the table, talking about how, like, look, if we presuppose that the universe is infinite, these paradoxes just seem insoluble. But if we suppose that the universe is finite, then these paradoxes go away. But the idea that the universe is finite is going to favor theism more than it is naturalism. So, and I sympathize with that line of thought, because I do think that, look, if the universe was infinite and eternal, like a steady state model would have, implied, then that would have been evidence against theism, and that would have been evidence for naturalism. So by the same token, if I can't say that an infinite universe is evidence for naturalism and not theism, and a finite universe is evidence for naturalism. Now we're not playing the game here.
I get it. These are the rabbit holes I tend to go down, and I think that's the issue, because I actually, as an atheist, I don't think that there's an infinite amount of stuff in actual existence. So I have to make certain assumptions about reality, and I think that the thing is I have to admit that that's just a paradigm for me, that there's just some arbitrary factor out there that makes it so that there's not an infinite number of purple trees, for example, a universe with purple trees in it. There's some limiting factor, and it might be arbitrary. So, for example, there might be 1 in a quadrillion chance that a purple tree spawns, and 1 in a quadrillion chance that a squirrel will spawn, and only the squirrel will spawn enough to, even though they have the same odds in all of existence, like something like that. But to me, again, these are where the conversations go with me. But now we're no longer remotely talking about morality at this point, or what's good and bad. We're so far from what the problem of evil actually is at this point that it's kind of absurd. So, because you have to start positing that there are all these different possibilities in order for this perfect being to be perfect. That's the gist of it. Like, in order for God to be perfect, you have to make some wild assumptions about the nature of reality. Because if you presume that God is perfect, then this is the best possible world. However, if you think that God is perfect and something like hell exists, even unto itself, then the best possible world is this one. So this exact same universe where some random atheist died alone in a forest and went, give me a sign, please, and butterfly spell God, and he's like, oh, thank you, and dies and goes to heaven. That universe is impossible by virtue of the fact that he went to heaven and nothing else.
I wanted to ask Benjamin a question.
Okay.
Because this came across me once. There are those who are, I guess, spiritualists who believe in God, or they're like sort of a paganistic spiritualist type of people that believe in ultimately a monotheistic God. Okay. Well, what they'll argue to remedy the problem of evil is they'll say, and I'll ask you, if you, let's say you were going to go onto this high-tech VR system, right? And you were going to immerse yourself into this virtual reality, okay? And part of the agreement when you immerse yourself into this virtual reality is you're going to go through all kinds of suffering and problems, and it could possibly be, really dangerous, war, you'll be in a war, you get your leg shot, all kinds of anything you can imagine. If a person was to sign a contract and say, hey, I'm willing to sign up, let's do it, I want to learn for whatever sufficient reasons, I want to do this, I want to join on it, and you can erase my memories while I'm in the virtual reality, so I think it's real, it's the reality. Would it be immoral for someone to respect that person's wishes, to go into this VR where there's possibly all these sort of sufferings and evils? Would you consider that an immoral thing for the person who allows them to go through that?
So if we're going to say this, when you ask the question, we have to ask, do you mean perfectly moral? So we can use an analogy here with if we can imagine a perfectly loving parent. And so a perfectly loving parent is going to want to give their children the freedom to make decisions on their own, because that's a good thing. But they're also going to care about their well-being and how they learn their lessons. So parents don't just, send their kids into war zones in order for them to learn certain lessons. They can teach those lessons without giving them so much freedom. So there's obviously a balance there. But also this might be a good time to segue into what Ryan and I have been working on. When we're thinking about something like perfection personified, we're thinking of a perfect being. The analogy here would be that God would create, a perfect God couldn't create anything less than a perfect world. The analogy being a perfect craftsman couldn't create anything less than a perfect craft. A perfect artist couldn't create anything less than a perfect work of art. And so we want to argue that, look, that means that there would be no suffering, sin, or evil at all. So while you give all of if you're a perfect being and you give all of your finite creatures free will in order to make morally significant decisions, that's all well and good. They would just always choose rightly. They would just, like, you as a perfect being would actualize morally mature creatures that always choose right, who never suffered, and so there would be no evil. And so you think, well, is this world even possible? Christians are already committed to this possibility if they believe that there's this place called heaven. That there's this place where there are souls, where people have free will. They're not robots, but they don't have significant freedom. They can't choose evil, but they can make significant morally free choices in heaven. There's no suffering, there's no evil, there's no sin. And so in this context, when we lay this problem, if we're then imagining, okay, well, then would a perfect being let one of these perfect creatures go into this VR world where they wouldn't have any memory of the perfect world they were from, in order to do evil, to suffer, to sin? And what is the value added in that? Ryan and I want to say none. That it would just be irrational for a perfect creature to want to go into that VR machine, and it would be irresponsible for a perfect being to allow their perfect creature to make such a mistake.
I guess the only issue I have on that answer is it just depends on the definition of perfection, number one, and being like God. Like a spiritualist would say, well, what is perfection to you? Like, you know, what you may, it's a subjective thing. Maybe you think that there should be no free choice and that people should just live in bliss, and that's the perfect moral standard.
Sure. So you're absolutely right. You're absolutely right that the concept of God that we're using here is super important. So if you're talking about someone that's not imagining a perfect being in this whole, complete, absolute sense, then this line of reasoning is not available to you. But it's not even clear that a problem of evil would arise for the conception of God that you're putting on the table, because there's the question of, is this God omnipotent? Are they morally perfect? Those are the two properties that we need on the table, or maybe not even perfect power and perfect morality, but even just maximal or just a lot. You know, this idea
that suppose we actually did build a VR where we could go back in history into some virtual landscape that we created and go through all the trials and tribulations of life in particular epoch or history, right? I think that unless a person was forced into that situation, that would be immoral if they were forced into it. But if they weren't forced into it and that they wanted to do this, you know, for their own volition, I don't see that that's really immoral. Where the problem comes in, though, is when we define God, like you said, as a perfectly moral being, that, you know, this is, you know, it just depends on your definitions, I guess.
I kind of wanted to speak to that. So the way I've been running the problem of evil has actually been talking about, rather than framing it in terms of like evil and immorality and stuff, I'm framing it in terms of success and failure. So the problem of failure. And that way you can get rid of language like evil or moral, and you're not so caught up on the terms, because instead you can just ask a theist, or whether it be Christian or not, is there any failure in terms of how God sees the world? In other words, do you think, or maybe by example, you could ask, do you think God wanted the world exactly as it is? And most Christians are going to say no, right? There are examples where God desires or wants that everyone not perish, but there are people going to perish, right? So there is a state of non-success there. And so then there's the compatibility between that and omnipotence, right? The idea is that omnipotence, in this case, sort of implies a kind of infallibility, that you can succeed every time you try to do something, that you do succeed every time you try to do something. So that's how I kind of run the problem of evil. Is I don't want to get stuck on the terms moral and evil. When you talk on kind of philosophy terms or other philosophers, I do bring in those terms, but when you're talking to the average person, you know, then you get in a debate about what the nature of evil is, and then they do their, you know, they might be a semantic move they might make, but that's why I typically like to talk in terms of, did God succeed with respect to what he wanted to do? If he didn't succeed, he failed, and if he failed, there's a problem. He didn't know how. He didn't have the ability to succeed with respect to his aims, and then that's a strike against omnipotence.
Yeah,
it's kind of a similar tactic to. It's fairly common to couch, to sort of get rid of that language of good and evil by couching the problem of evil or embedding it in the language of suffering, right? So just the problem of suffering, right? So we don't need to talk about evil. Like, let's just talk about suffering. There's clearly a lot of suffering in the world, and so that can you can run the problem that way. So that's a very similar approach.
The tension between God's perfect love and the existence of suffering in the world. So you can say that, look, while they might seem like thick normative concepts, they're actually just purely descriptive and psychological description. So we say God is perfectly loving. No theist wants to deny that their God is less than perfectly loving. But there are entailment relations between the property being loving and what it's like for an object of love to suffer. So we have expectations. So the properties we attribute to someone, such as loving, have implications for how that being is going to respond to certain things in the world, like the suffering of who they love. And so those properties have implications that constrain the way of the world, the way we would expect the world to appear, if it indeed had this being with the property of love, and the observation that the world is just suffused with suffering.
Well, I spoke to a Christian maybe a year ago. Not sure what denomination this was. It must have been like a really ambiguous sort of religion, but he was telling me that actually the God of the Old Testament is evil. That the God of the Bible is evil, and actually
it creates evil.
Yeah, he creates evil. He creates the light and the darkness. He created Adam and Eve, and you see how that turned out in Noah's flood, and it was like a series of blunders. And he says, and this is pointing to the fact that the demiurge, or whoever his name is the one that came to become a false god on the earth. And so all the evil that you see in the world is a result of this demiurge or whatever. And the real God is called the Father, and Jesus came to talk about the
really
Father. And interesting, but it still gets back to definitions of the Father now. So this God called the Father, which is not Yahweh. Yahweh is the evil God. This God apparently created an angel or a lesser God called the demiurge that created evil. So in a sense, it chains back to God anyway. So we still get stuck with the problem of evil, right? So it's just really interesting to see how many mental gymnastics theists will go through just to kind of make things fit. And it's just really interesting. And I've always said that a lot of this stuff comes because they just have this feeling. They just want to continue on with this feeling. All these arguments, evidence, all of this stuff doesn't really mean anything to them because they want to feel loved by some loving father. I was there. I was one of them.
Did you say this was a Christian? Or
yeah, it was a Christian. I think he was like a splinter from, I think he was a modern day Essene, I guess is what he called himself. An Essene, a church of Ascended church.
I would just say that this person they just believe a straightforward contradiction. So I think that they would want to say that their God is worthy of our worship, but that he's also evil. And so I think it would be very easy to just point out, look, he can't be worthy of worship and evil. That's just a contradiction. Something that's worthy of our worship is not evil. Just by definition, that's what we mean by the term worthy of our worship. We obviously do not have any sort of obligation to worship something evil. And so, and if he wanted to deny that, I would just say, okay, fine. That's the bullet he bites. Again, I'm not trying to convince anyone. I'm not trying to, beat anyone with it, with this, or use this argument as a weapon in any sort of way. I would just say, okay, if that's the bullet you're going to bite, awesome. But now they understand why we aren't going to come over into their camp.
Exactly.
Like if you're just saying, look, in order to believe what you believe, if that's the bullet I have to bite, no thanks.
Yeah. And the scriptures that they use to back it up are very, the Dead Sea Scrolls and things like that. So it's like really esoteric and not very popular view, and it has a lot of problems. So ultimately, when I investigated it and looked into it, it's just kicking the can down the road, basically, is what these guys.
Well, it really does. It doesn't. Yeah, it doesn't help at all, really. I mean, so now you have to ask the question of why Super God or the ultimate God is allowing a demiurge or this other rogue god to go, and do all these horrible things. So you still have like what's supposed to be the perfect God sitting back and just sort of letting these things happen. So I don't think it really helps.
It's always kind of strange.
It's
always kind of strange how that move is supposed to absolve God of his responsibility somehow. Yeah. Like that's the ethical part of the claim that I just honestly can't make any sense of. So to give an analogy, let's imagine that I'm created a robot, and so I program it to do all these things, but then I say, okay, you know what? I'm going to give it free will. I put aside all the technical challenges. I give it free will, and I say, okay, robot, go, with free will that I've given, go out in the world, and that robot goes and just like destroys a city or does something like really horrendous. Yeah. Like, can I really say that I'm not responsible for the actions of that? Like, how does me giving it free will absolve me of my responsibility for creating that and then just setting it loose on the world without understanding how much havoc and harm it could cause? Doesn't seem to be. And so I think the same would apply to a God that creates the world. Okay, he creates a world with free creatures, and if those free creatures go wrong, it doesn't just absolve him of his responsibility for having created those creatures. He's not just off the hook, and it's all the creatures' fault and not his. This may be another good place to transition into one of the arguments that Ryan and I have been working on. I don't know if anyone else wanted to say anything before I do that.
No, by all means, brother. Please do.
So one of the arguments that Ryan and I have been working on is in combination with another argument that's been defended by Ryan Mullins and Joe Schmid, this idea of an aloneness argument. So the aloneness argument, I won't bore you with the details that go along with that because it's an objection to classical theism. But the basic premise of that is that God could have existed alone, that it's a metaphysical possibility, and that theists are created to. God could have created nothing. He created something rather than nothing, and that's what explains why there's something rather than nothing. So theists are committed to this idea that God could have just created nothing. It's possible that a perfect being such as God could exist alone without creating anything else. And so that's like the first key premise. Because then we want to say that God has all relevant, morally relevant good-making properties and no evil-making properties. So we call this claim prior purity, this idea that prior to creation, God is just perfectly good. There's no evil in God at all. Nothing. He's just pure, undifferentiated goodness, and he has all morally relevant making properties already obtained. God is perfectly loving. God is perfectly just. God is perfectly merciful. All of the good making properties you would want to ascribe to God that are morally relevant, he has them. So those two claims, So far so good. Those two claims entail that given a possible world where God exists alone, God has all morally relevant good-making properties and no evil-making properties. So that's a pretty uncontroversial part of the argument, unless with a few exceptions. Someone might deny that God couldn't exist alone, or someone might deny that, prior to creation, God has just this little bit of evil in him. I don't know. Maybe they do. But given
that creation is a part of God's nature because it's part of his goodness. It's better for a thing to be than not to be, and therefore creation unto itself is better than not creation. So it implies a more perfect being than one that doesn't create anything. So therefore the perfect being must create something or something along those lines. Does that sound at all familiar?
It does, but so Ryan and I would want to push back on this by saying that, like, look, so there's actually a problem a little bit logically prior to this. It's the property of non-God, the problem of non-God objects. So what do we mean by that? So God, again, is a perfect being. Prior to creation, he's perfect. And so if we're saying that he's perfect, we're saying that he's not deficient in any way. So this idea of why would God create at all? Creating something seems to imply that he's deficient in some way. That, just like you said, that God's goodness isn't realized unless he also creates. And so that idea is just incompatible with that notion. The other, with non-God objects. But let's say God would create. Even though he's perfect, prior purity, he would still create just for the goodness of itself. Okay? So the question then becomes, how does there's two different questions here, or two different ways of thinking about this. There's the modeling way, like if the world is modeled after God, well, God doesn't have any evil in him. So the model of God also, or the model of the creation also shouldn't have any evil in it. If they're modeled, or like if we are made in the image of God, then that image doesn't have any evil in it. So where does evil come from?
Well,
That's one way of thinking about it.
Yeah, that sort of brings up a question. And just thinking on that, I could see Christians kicking back, but I would actually say, can you at least then understand how the unbeliever is turned off by God in that case? Because look at it this way. Let's say you have a bowl of soup that's perfect, a nice, wonderful bowl of soup that's delicious. And then right next to it, you have this crap on the table right next to it. Stinks, disgusting, all of that. Are you going to want to eat of that bowl? I mean, even if God is this bowl of soup and he's also created this stuff on the table that's just abhorrent, you know, I mean, can you at least understand why an unbeliever would be kind of turned off from that? You know, those are the kind of questions I may ask. I don't know if that applies or not.
Something that you said, part of your argument kind of inspires a thought where it seems like if God's alone, the state of affairs are perfect. And if they're perfect, they can't be improved upon. If they can't be improved upon, there can't be a reason to act, right? Because if you have a reason to act, to not act would have been to settle for a lesser state of affairs. But it's not the case that you're in a state where it's a lesser state of affairs. So in other words, that if God decides to create, it would be like and a completely indeterministic. Yeah, it'd be just arbitrary.
It would just because God is perfectly free. So again, there's another close claim here that the theist is committed to, that God is perfectly free, that God could have created nothing. He could have just decided not to create at all, or he could have created our world, or he could have created some other world entirely. So there's at least three options on the table for God. He could create nothing, he could create our world, or he could create some other world. So the theist is committed to that if they want to say God is perfectly free. If we're going to say that God has to create of necessity, then that seems like we're going to have to sacrifice the claim that God is perfectly free.
And you get into modal collapse, perhaps, right?
You can get it. Yeah, you're starting to threaten modal fatalism. We don't want to do that. So the conclusion that I had drawn from those two claims was that given a possible world where God exists alone, God has all morally good-making properties and no evil-making properties. So now we want to put another premise on the table, a premise that is a metaphysical premise, but that we think is virtually uncontroversial. And that premise is that if some property P, we'll call it P, obtains, while another property Q does not, then P does not entail Q. So let's say property P is love and property Q is hate. So prior to creation, God is love, and hate doesn't obtain, then love does not entail hate. That's the claim in essence. So what follows from that is that there are no evil-making properties entailed by morally relevant good-making properties. All of the good-making properties in God prior to creation don't entail any evil-making properties. So this is a really important conclusion. Why is it a really important conclusion? Because theodicy says, look, God allows certain evils because they're necessary for some higher order good. So to give an example, danger is a necessary evil for the moral virtue of courage. You couldn't have courage unless you had danger. So courage entails danger. And so that's why God would allow some of these evils, because on the whole, these worlds are better for having these evils in them than if they didn't have these evils at all. We want to say that's false. The conclusion that we just drew is false. There was a perfect world prior to creation that did not entail any such good-making properties. So then we're going to say a perfect being such as God prevents all evil-making properties not entailed by some morally relevant good-making property. But our previous conclusion was that there just are no evil-making properties entailed by morally good-making properties. So from there it follows a perfect being such as God prevents all evil-making properties but obviously our world does contain some evil-making properties, and you can pick whatever your favorite example of an evil is here. And so this goes back to the point Danny was making, like, look, if there's even just one evil at all, that observation entails there is no such being. And so we want to say that this is a logical problem of evil, that this, if you believe that so really there's just three claims that we put on the table. God can exist alone. God prior to creation is perfect. There's no evil in God at all. And that if some property P obtains while another property Q does not, then P does not entail Q. Those are the only premises that we appeal to, other than the premise that there evil exists, which very few people are going to deny that there are things such as evils or imperfections or sin or suffering in the world. That's just kind of a given premise. The only other premises that you can deny are those other three premises.
Now, inadvertently, they might
really
say things. Inadvertently, they might say things that don't imply that do imply there's no evil or anything like that. I think, for instance, when Calvinists say that everything is for God's glory, including evil, then it seems like what they're saying there, although it would need to be fleshed out, is that, well, sin and evil ought to have happened for the sake of God's glory. Mm-hmm. And if it ought to have happened, then in what sense would it be evil? And so there might be an argument there for when a Calvinist says that even when sin is ordained by God, it's for God's glory, that sin ought to have happened, right? If it was for God's glory. So I think there's occasion, even the term, now I wonder if you've ever thought about this, even the term a necessary evil, like I had a good example of a necessary evil for me is getting pricked to get vaccinated. Like I have to go through getting pricked with a needle to get vaccinated. But if I was all powerful, I would just get vaccinated without getting pricked. But the point is that because I'm limited, I have to do something I don't want to do to fulfill a goal. And given that God is not limited, right, I just don't see any room for necessary evils, right? But when there is a necessary evil, even bracketing that concern, it just seems like I should get pricked given my goal to get immune from COVID, right? Like, in what sense given my limitation, I should let it happen. It's not something I ought not do.
And so, and also, I just wanted to add, sorry, just real quick, because I think if you were to say that Calvinist move that evil is for the glory of God, that's just straightforwardly denying the second premise that Ryan and I want to put on the table, that God has all morally relevant good-making properties and no evil-making properties. They're just going to have to deny that and say, like, no, God's glory entails evil. And that's a contradiction of its own. So it just trades one contradiction for another. So it's not clear that they've actually solved this problem. Go ahead. I'm sorry, I interrupted you.
We're going to be wrapping up here really soon. At least I am, anyway. Come to think of it, you guys are more than welcome to carry on if you would like. With Bryce not being here, it's more or less. I feel it's a bit less formal than usual. But before I go, I at least want to mention this. There's somebody from the audience, Xavier, that asked a question. I think it would be great for Danny. Question for the guest: why did God create, knowing that His perfect creation, quote, will fail? Is God able to fail? If not, why said that His creation was good?
Yeah, a typical property of God is infallibility, and I think that the notion of infallibility is strongly tied to omnipotence, right? I think that you might need a few arguments to get here, but I think that when I fail, it means I didn't know how to succeed in some sense. Like I didn't have the ability to succeed. And if I didn't have the ability to succeed, that's a strike against my power. Okay. Now, that might be a non-traditional way of going from infallibility to omnipotence. But yeah, so I think that if an omnipotent being, infallibility, I totally agree. It seems like when God created, if He has those properties, everything that happens will be a kind of state of success. and that's just rejecting the notion of an imperfect world.
Yeah, be prepared to hear an answer to that, like something like, well, perfection means completeness in the Bible, and so if reality is complete, reality is going to entail the bad and the good, the light and the dark, everything that the prophet Isaiah spoke about. And they're going to say, yeah, so actually by allowing failure, he actually accounts for perfection that way.
Yeah, I don't know what kind of theist you're talking to, Scott. I don't know.
So again, I would just say, look, that that conception of God just entails that God is evil, and that's just incompatible with being worthy of worship.
Yep.
Worthy of worship. Okay.
Trading one contradiction for another.
Yep.
What is? I kind of want to ask one more time. Maybe I forgot. What is worthy of worship in your mind?
So a being that's worthy of our worship is to use the jargon of perfect being theism, is the greatest possible being. So we get this from Saint Anselm. So God is going to have all of his good making properties into their maximal degree. So if it's finite, we have this question of why is it one way rather than another? And so instead of introducing that complexity to a model, he's either going to have it or he doesn't. And so he's going to have it infinitely or he's not going to have it at all. So God is going to have all these good making property. If he's wholly worthy of our worship, meaning that his existence demands in a normative sense our reverence, our attention. And so that we should, or must care about this thing. And it is our greatest possible benefactor. It would have all of these good making properties to their maximal degree. Things like love, justice, mercy, benevolence, all these things that we would consider good and great. Why should we, what would it take to admire such a being in such a way that it was always worthy of our worship? Well, it's going to have certain properties like never being blameworthy, always being praiseworthy. These other, ethical concepts, but also limitations on his power and knowledge. So if we thought, that he was somehow ignorant or was fallible in the way in which he acted or could know things in the world, we would think we could imagine a greater possible being than that. We could imagine a being with omniscience. We could imagine a being with omnipotence. We can imagine a being with moral perfection that just always chose right. And so that's the concept of the greatest possible being. And that if you move away from this Anselmian perfect being theism, this idea of the greatest possible being, well, then now we're not talking about a being that's wholly worthy of our worship. We're talking about some other finite being, some being that's less than worthy of our worship. And no theologian is going to want to say, in a monotheistic tradition of Islam, Judaism, and Christianity, no theologian is going to say our God is just less than perfect. That's just or is just not worthy of our worship. So he's worthy of our worship on Sundays, but he's not worthy of our worship any other day. Like no one's going to want to say that.
Okay, no, I guess I was just confused about the semantics of it because, like you said, it's synonymous with a maximal being or greatest possible being or something like that, which I certainly. I wasn't making.
We get that from Anselm.
Yeah. Okay. All right. Well, by the way, guys, we are slightly past our hour mark, which is where we usually cut out the show. Is there anyone that has the urge to continue on? I can go for a little while longer if need be. So, if there's somebody that feels like they really have something to add, now's the time.
I've talked a lot, so I'll give the floor to other people who want to speak.
Yeah, I'm gonna. I'm feeling under the weather. I actually tested positive for COVID today, unfortunately.
No.
Oh, man. Problem of evil. Ah.
All the evil, I know. Yeah.
On that silver lining, you get like a 2-week vacation at least. There's that.
Yeah.
I'm sorry to hear that. So I think there was another question from the audience earlier that I had missed. I feel bad if I missed these, and I know that I missed one. Oh, here's one. Is it possible to be a better? Is it possible to be a better world by having suffering, so we know how good the good is? Okay, I think I get that. Is it the case that the best possible world actually has suffering because it's good to know what good is, and it's the only way to know how good is to have a contrast.
Yeah, the way that. Yeah, go ahead. Go ahead.
I want to say no. So for the very argument that I gave before is prior to creation, God does it. He's perfectly good. He knows everything about there. He knows everything there is to know about goodness, but he can't suffer. He doesn't suffer. He does not have to experience evil in order to have this knowledge. So God can just create morally mature creatures who just already know and appreciate the good and don't require evil in order to know that. The theist there needs the claim that, look, a knowledge of good entails that evil exists in order to have that knowledge. But they can't make that claim if they also believe that prior to creation, God has a knowledge of everything evil, but doesn't require evil to exist to have that knowledge.
Well, here's my question: like, if food only tastes good, right? Is it conceivable that you could just like keep having better and better foods? Is that a possibility? Of course, I'd say it is. Like, you could always be surprised by something new or exciting or different, and it's just better. But you don't need bad to have better. I guess that's the layman's way of like.
Well, so it is. It's not so clear that we can extend these concepts of infinity to qualities like taste. So I can say, look, there might be an infinite number of things in the world, but it's not so sure that I can have this infinite flavor to my chicken soup, to use a silly example. Like it's not at all. And so we can go back to our analogy between a perfect craft and a perfect craftsman. So a perfect craftsman, does it mean that the quality of their craft is
No, I
infinite?
didn't mean the taste in terms of perfection. I was contrasting the good with the bad. Like this question to me voted of this idea that in order for good to be good, you need bad because bad makes good gooder. And
Yeah.
I'm saying maybe not. Like, I mean, just on a hypothetical, like if there was no bad food, it could be gooder.
But there's also another interesting response here in that God could teach us all of these lessons that we need to be learned, or all these comparisons in dreams. So that God, if we needed a knowledge of, what bad food tasted like so that we could appreciate the better food, we could just taste bad food in dreams in where they don't actually obtain. And so they're not of any moral significance. Or, say, oh, God wants us to be courageous and experience these virtues of courage. Well, there could be a world where just there are no dangers except in dreams. And so that people can learn the value of these virtues by things that don't obtain in the actual world that are morally relevant.
That's really clever. That's a really good idea. Well, all right, guys. Unless anybody has something immediately pressing, raise your hand right away. I'm going to go ahead and wrap up. Guys, I want to thank you very much for this. This is rather impromptu for me. Bryce wasn't able to make it, I'm sorry to say. But Bryce, we thank you anyway for all your hard work, and you deserve your nights off all the same. Benjamin, Ryan, Scotty, and Danny, thanks again. If you have something, any links that you would like to add to the comments, we'll try to get those posted in the description after the fact. And I want to thank our audience as well. As always, we wouldn't be here if it wasn't for you guys. So please like and subscribe if you like what you listen to. Follow any of these guys. If they have material, they'll post the links, hopefully. We'll see you guys again next week, 7:30. Have a good one.